cloud option. Fantastic. Okay, good. All right, we are officially recording. I will call the meeting to order. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Howard County Democratic Central Committee, for joining us on our monthly scheduled Central Committee meeting. As you all recall from our March Central Committee meeting, we all agreed that every month we're going to be meeting a new governor candidate that's running in 2022. Mr. Ashwani Jain has been so graciously to make time for us today to join us to talk a little bit about his candidacy and his campaign. We're going to offer him an audience. So we're going to offer him about 7 to 10 minutes to let us know some of the great things that he's doing on with his campaign. We'll offer about another 5 minutes for a Q&A session, and we're going to try to make this available later on our Facebook page to share with the rest of our Howard County community as we continue this thing. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome candidate for governor, Mr. Ashwani Jain.
All right, thank you so much. And everyone can hear me fine?
Yes, sir.
Okay, perfect. Well, yeah, thank you so much for this opportunity. I just wanted to introduce myself real briefly, and then happy to answer any questions that anyone has. So for starters, my name is Ashwani Jain. I use he, him pronouns. I'm a 31-year-old son of immigrants who's been lucky enough to beat cancer and go from a Make-A-Wish kid to a Make-A-Wish ambassador, go from a Title I elementary school to later earning 2 bachelor's and 1 master's degree. I've been able to work in the public sector, private sector, and nonprofit sector, as well as serve in President Obama and then Vice President Biden's White House, as well as in 2 federal agencies. And I'm now humbled to run an inclusive and accessible campaign for Maryland governor. If elected next year, I would serve as the nation's youngest and first millennial governor and Maryland's first governor of color. And I only bring this up to both highlight the perspective I would bring and also to address some of the concerns that people will have who think this overly ambitious, eager millennial with a baby face should maybe just wait my turn in line. But while a voice like mine has never been in the governor's office before, in a state that is not only younger and more diverse than it's ever been, but where more Marylanders want leaders who have similar lived experiences and are going to include them in the decision-making process, I think voices like all of ours are growing and need to be represented. Because at the end of the day, I think decisions about us should not be made without us. And so with a completely vacant governor seat, I'm running for governor because I think it's the most effective position to get money out of our politics, to increase accountability, to tackle issues in a comprehensive way, and also to ensure that all residents have a real seat at the table. Now, this idea of inclusion and accessibility started back when I was 13 years old and diagnosed with a type of cancer. During that time, I saw a world in which I may not get to leave the 4 walls of that hospital room. And I saw kids sitting right next to me lose their battles while their parents went bankrupt with medical bills. I felt guilt for the pain I was causing my family. I felt depressed and alone. And I found that many people were making decisions for me as opposed to making them with me. And so it made me feel really powerless. And I thought, if I was given a second chance at life, I was going to make it count. And luckily, I not only beat cancer, but was really able to go from survivor to advocate. And by getting involved in politics, I found opportunities to connect with others who had similar struggles. I got a chance to feel a sense of community and purpose, and also a way to channel my pain into something positive. And that advocacy work has now led me to run for governor, because I've learned that a successful leader is one who understands both how to create policy, but also has the perspective to enforce policy in an equitable way. Now, for almost 2 decades, I've advocated for public policy at all levels of government and all across this state, including leadership roles with both President Obama and then Vice President Biden. And so I understand a little bit of how to create policies. But more importantly, as a product of Maryland public schools, as a son of immigrants and small business owners, as a cancer survivor who's battled both physical and mental health issues, I understand the importance of inclusion and accessibility in our politics. And that's why I'm running a truly grassroots peer-to-peer campaign where I'm empowering volunteers as young as middle schoolers all the way to those who are retired to help me create policies and help me develop outreach strategies. That's also why I focus on making structural changes that get money out of politics. And I've created a relief, recovery, reform agenda that spans over 15 topics and over 40 specific issues covering short-term and long-term solutions, including ways to pay for all of my ideas. So I sincerely want to be a partner in the governor's office, and I really appreciate this time and your opportunity, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Jain. We appreciate the time, and I do see a couple of hands up, so we'll go ahead and get started with Mr. Latimer. Mr. Tim, please go ahead.
Thank you, Shahan, and thank you, Mr. Jain, for joining us this evening. Really appreciate you presenting and sharing some of your ideas with us. As you may well know, Maryland is one of the states that's most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. I'd be curious to know what your thoughts are on what Maryland can do to be a leader in climate. If you are governor, would you support, for example, a bill such as the Climate Solutions Act, which just failed in the most recent General Assembly, and put Maryland on a path toward even deeper greenhouse gas reduction emissions, as well as making our state more resilient to the impacts of climate change? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. Short answer is yes. Longer answer is I start with, how do we talk about climate change, right? We talk about climate change as not only the greatest threat we have, but I also talk about it as the greatest economic opportunity and a way to reduce some of the racial inequities that we have found. And so going back to what I call my relief, recovery, reform agenda, relief, I talk about climate justice. So reforming the Commission on Environmental Justice itself, so it has better representation. We have more transparent and regular meeting requirements as well. I talk about cleaner energy, so banning fracking, deactivating our coal power plants while putting a transition place for those employees of those plants. I talk about stop subsidizing the trash incinerators that we have in the state. They're currently still classified as renewable energy sources, but they're obviously not. When I talk about recovery, I talk about making mass transit more accessible. I talk about smart growth. So when we have our towns and our cities being built, in our master plans, we should have mixed use development. I talk about increasing solar power, hydropower, wind power. I talk about home construction and making sure that any new homes that are being built have net zero energy from the time that they are constructed, by ensuring that builders are optimizing, things like insulation thickness and other heating and cooling energy use tactics. And when I talk about reform, I talk about things like banning the single-use plastic bags. I talk about making food waste and composting a lot more accessible. You all have done a great job in Howard County, really providing composting opportunities for residents. And I want to take that model and implement it statewide. I also want to end the state funding of synthetic turf on playgrounds. And I also want to rejoin the Regional Transportation Climate Initiative that our current governor removed us from. So those are some of the details and some of the ways in which I'm approaching the issue. But what I'll say with this, and I'll say with any issue, is you can always go to my website, jainforgovernor.com, where I've actually had about 30 to 70 pages of detailed notes on a range of issues, including climate change, because I do think it's important.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Latimer. I'd like to move on to Ms. Jessica Nichols for the next question.
Good evening, Mr. Jain, and thank you so much for spending time with us. As the mother of a 24-year-old who is very politically active, I'm very excited to see a very young person getting into this race. So I wanted to just ask you a question about education. As you know, in many cases in Maryland, your zip code determines the type of education that you receive. And I wanted to know, what is your plan to ensure equity in Maryland school systems, so it doesn't matter if you go to the poorest school or the wealthiest school, you are getting an equitable education that meets your needs?
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. So I think as a starting point, because I think every Democrat who's running for governor is going to say we need to fund our schools and our public schools, I think this is where the perspective I bring might be able to start off with some good answers. So as a starting point, I went to a Title I elementary school, where most of the students were on farm. There were mold on the ceilings, overcrowded by students, a lot of great educators who just didn't have the support they needed. And then years later, when I was in middle school and was going through cancer treatments, I remember how the entire ecosystem of my school, right? So that's everyone from the bus driver to the cafeteria lady, my guidance counselor, my teachers, my fellow students, even the building itself literally became my safe place where I felt supported. And so those are the perspectives that I bring when I talk about the need to reduce teacher shortages, the need to increase the pipeline of diverse teachers, the need to decrease the student-teacher ratio, and to address your specific issue, the need to reprioritize funding so that schools like I went to, a Title I school, has more equitable funding. So some more specifics, when I talk about my relief, recovery, reform agenda, relief, I talk about forgiving student debt for educators. I talk about reducing some of the barriers to becoming a teacher by allowing those with associate degrees in the art of teaching to also take the Praxis 1 and 2 exams to get the certification that they need. I talk about affordable housing because it's tied into it, right? Because a lot of our educators can't even afford to live and send their own kids to where they teach. I talk about things like expanding broadband and also assisting some of the children of our military families. Maryland has some of the highest populations of military affiliated children in the country. And these children on average move every 2 or 3 years. And so really making sure we're looking at all of our residents equitably. When I talk about recovery, I talk about making community colleges more affordable and more accessible. I talk about investing in trade schools because they're just as valuable as college educations and four-year institutions, but we need to provide more support for those schools. I talk about looking at school constructions themselves, right? Because as you know, districts with higher minority populations often have the oldest facilities. And so again, reprioritizing the funding for lower income neighborhoods and using prevailing wage laws to also include school construction projects. I talk about increasing access to STEM programs. Women and minority students are historically underrepresented. And so making sure we have more STEM programs and after school programs as early as middle school, I think is super important. And then finally, when I talk about reform, I talk about obviously supporting the Corbin Commission, which finally got passed in the Senate. I was with the Teachers Union in 2018, supporting the Corbin Commission, supporting the casino education lockbox. But now it's working with our State Board of Education to actually implement a lot of those findings. I talk about universal pre-K, and I also talk about eliminating the SRO programs in our public schools. So that's a little bit of everything, but it does, I think, need to be addressed in a comprehensive way, which hopefully I've addressed your question.
Thank you. You have.
Okay, thank you for the question, Ms. Nichols. For our final question, we're going to move to Central Committee member Josh Friedman in the interest of time. So this will be our final question for our candidate today. So Mr. Friedman, go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, just real quick, just from a purely strategic standpoint, what is your campaign finance plan? And the reason I ask is I think, we had an issue the last election where I think there was our nominee essentially got a lot of celebrity Hollywood money through the primary, and then after the primary, it was like kind of like, well, hey, either you guys have you're on your own now. You guys have to raise the money, or the Republicans win, which they did. Mm-hmm. Are you going to be able to finance a campaign all the way through the general election?
So short answer is yes, but I also am taking a really non-traditional approach. And to give your answer a real specific and sincere answer, there are 3 specific ways where I think I'm going to win. Number 1, I can speak to this particular moment in time that we're in. Number 2, I think I can expand the electorate and really excite the base. And number 3, I feel like I'm leading on issues. And so diving a little deeper real quickly, when I talk about speaking to this particular moment in time we're in, 2021, 2022, our state is younger and more diverse than it's ever been. And more people understand that elected experience is not the only kind that matters. That's why we have a record number of first-time and younger elected officials in our Maryland Senate, in our Maryland House. We also, just since the 2018 election, have doubled the number of newly registered voters. So we have 500,000 newly registered voters. So the electorate has also changed. And traditionally redder counties like a Frederick, like an Anne Arundel, have turned blue. And so given my professional and personal experiences, I think I can actually create the policies and bring that perspective to the table. Number 2, when I talk about exciting the base and expanding the electorate, people would not only be more excited to vote for someone who would be the first millennial governor in the nation, but like I said, someone they can relate to. And going to my campaign strategy, the fact that I already have 180 active volunteers, which is more than typically governor campaigns have, about 120 active volunteers by the time the election rolls around, I'm already exceeded that only 3 months into the campaign, and really bringing in middle schoolers, high schoolers, college students to the table to help me with the campaign. I think that is really expanding the base and bringing in new first-time voters. And then finally, when I talk about leading on issues, right, I'm not only running a campaign based on hope and inclusion, but from day 1 of my campaign in January, I've already had detailed policy proposals on a range of issues, including ways to fund and pay for my ideas. So I think all of those things, with the virtual setting and with the fact that there's a completely vacant governor seat for the first time in almost a decade, I think those are the reasons where specifically I feel I have an advantage, and I think I can actually work hard enough to win.
Okay. Thank you for the question, Mr. Friedman. Mr. Jain, I think that concludes our time with you today. Is there anything you'd like to leave for us in closing?
Absolutely. So all I will say is I really do want to be a partner. I'm happy to make a one-on-one time to have a conversation with any of you, whether you want to get involved or just have a deeper conversation on any policies. So I'm going to put the email that I respond to in the chat. You can also go to my website at any point in time to find out more about my background and more details on the specific policies that I'm running on. But I would love to hear from you. And again, I really appreciate this time.
Thank you, Mr. Ashwani Jain. Appreciate your time, sir. And for the Central Committee, next month, we'll be meeting with candidate Mr. Peter Franchot. And so we'll tune in for that for our next session for the rest of the Howard County community. All right, that concludes our recording.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jain.
Thank you all so much.